Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. On behalf of the NBSAP Forum and the Equator Initiative, I welcome you all to our month-long webinar series titled Strengthening Indigenous Peoples' Capacity, Leadership, and Rights. This week's theme is on Indigenous conflict resolution and negotiation strategies. And today's webinar will focus on how Indigenous communities respond to threats, conflict resolution, and negotiation strategies that they use. I am Alejandra Pero, the webinar coordinator and facilitator, and I warmly welcome you all to this webinar session. I also would like to thank my colleague, Diego Ochoa. Today's webinar is hosted by Polly Grace and Hayley Haas. Hayley Haas is a practitioner director at Arma Legal. Arma Legal is an independent Australian law firm that focuses on native title claims, compensation claims, and negotiation. Hayley is an experienced legal practitioner in complex commercial dispute resolution and brings human rights advocacy and capacity building experience to her role, having advised several international human rights organizations. Polly Grace is a legal officer with the Kimberley Land Council in Northwestern Australia. Polly advises on a range of matters affecting the delivery of cultural and environmental services in the Kimberley. Polly has particular expertise in climate change law, advising native title holders on the establishment and registration of carbon projects as an opportunity for sustainable enterprise development. Today's webinar will focus on how Indigenous communities manage threats to their territories through effective conflict resolution and negotiation strategies. Practical skills and tools that can be used by Indigenous and local communities around the world to safeguard their land and territories will be shared. And examples will range from the encroachment of an extractive industry to payment for environment services, or PES, opportunities. I now would like to take the time to remind you all of certain rules and the dynamics in the webinar session. The microphones will be muted during the presentation. This will reduce interferences and will also facilitate the communication. We will have a 45-minute presentation by Hayley and Polly, followed by questions and answers and discussion. So please send us in advance if you have any questions. You can write them down, or you can use the raise your hand icon in the control panel of the GoToWebinar if you'd like to speak live and ask your question live. We will then open your microphone during that moment. We'd also like to advise that as many participants are not English native speakers, we just would like to advise you all to speak slowly and clearly so that everyone can understand each other. We will now transfer the webinar to Polly and to Hayley, and we welcome both of you and thank you so much for joining us. Hayley Haas, thanks so much.
Thank you, Alejandra, and thank you for that introduction. And hello, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me clearly. Today's webinar on Indigenous communities respond to threats, conflict resolution and negotiation strategies. It's a big topic and there are many issues under it that are worthy of discussion. But I wanted to focus in particular on the area that I work in particular, being largely to do with the negotiation between Indigenous communities, being native title groups in Australia and in particular in Western Australia, and proponents seeking to develop resources or exploit resources on those Indigenous communities' native title lands. So there are obviously risks and fractious outcomes that are associated with post-negotiation era, being once an agreement is negotiated. but that's another whole session in itself. So today I'm going to focus in particular on the risks and potential fractious outcomes that are associated with the pre-agreement negotiation phase. And whilst I in particular am focused on the jurisdiction here in Western Australia, hopefully there are some fundamentals to the presentation and to the strategies discussed that apply equally across jurisdictions today. So I'll make a start. So the extractive industries, they present two sides of the coin for Indigenous communities. There are risks, certainly, to Indigenous communities of a cultural, social and environmental nature that come of resource developers, mining companies, and proponents wanting to exploit resources on Indigenous native title lands. But on the other side of the coin, there are opportunities for the Indigenous communities to generate business employment opportunities and establish revenue streams through impacts compensation. In the Australian context, to give you some idea before we start, we're dealing primarily under the Native Title Act, which is a Commonwealth Act in Australia. And the strongest mechanism or process that's available to Indigenous groups under that Act in creating economic opportunities that the extractive industries present and in protecting their native title rights and their interests is the Native Title Act. Specifically, it's the Future Act regime under that Native Title Act. And there's a hierarchy of rights available to native title parties under the Future Acts regime in Australia and in Western Australia in particular. The right to negotiate sits at the top of that hierarchy. It applies to proposed acts of proponents, mining companies on native title lands, and it's designed to ensure that those acts can be lawfully done. The native title party's right to negotiate is time limited to 6 months. And this is particularly relevant to the strategies we'll be discussing today. During that 6 months, the developer or the proponent and the state government have to negotiate with the native title party in good faith. We won't go into detail about how the good faith element is established or interpreted in the Australian system, but it is an area of developing law. Now, I wanted to point out that this presentation, whilst I'm coming at it from the perspective of a legal practitioner, isn't exclusive to lawyers, and it could equally apply to strategic advisors, commercial advisors and negotiators representing Indigenous groups who are facing the encroachment of extractive industries on native title or Indigenous lands. Starting in particular with for the advisors and the negotiators representing groups, one of the key issues that springs to mind is that your client group is usually a large group of people with varying ties or relationships with one another. And this throws up quite a unique set of issues in terms of your representation of that group. It's imperative to have an effective flow of information to and from your client, the whole group client. And therefore, certainly in the context in which I work, it's critical to, at the point of the representatives of that client group being authorised, and so when that client group comes together to nominate the people that they want to act on their behalf, that representative group is large enough to be representative of the affected native title group in our context, or Indigenous group, but not so large as to be, I say, unwieldy. It's if the group that's representing the native title party is really numerous and they're only authorised to act in unison, for example, then you face a difficult situation where you haven't got a streamlined process for your negotiation. You're starting off with a system where you may be facing a slow and inefficient process due to the group that is nominated to represent the native title claim group being too large. It needs to be sufficiently representative, however, of the affected party. It doesn't serve the native title party's interest to have representatives of some groups within that Indigenous community and not others, because that means that obviously some interests will be being represented and others won't be. I should point out that for some people, advisors, negotiators, legal practitioners, you may actually not be involved in the process of the authorisation of representatives of the Indigenous group you're representing, and therefore this could all be out of your hands. But if you do happen to be involved in that process, then these are things to bear in mind. It's also important that those representatives are active and engaged members of your client group. You really want to be able to access the representative group easily, and not be sort of forcing people who are unwilling to for whatever reason to be representative of that group to come and give you to give instructions on how they wish to proceed at any certain stage of a negotiation. It's also very important that those representatives are appropriately senior or authorised within their family groups. Now, within the context in which I represent different groups here in Western Australia, each group has their own preference about what sort of people they want to represent them, but usually is a balance between senior people who are considered to be culturally senior within their group, and some younger people who are perhaps more well-versed in commercial matters, and that their families want to put them forward as being someone that might be able to help them in the commercial aspects of things, not so much on the cultural side of things where they might have nominated senior representatives. And it might seem obvious, but availability is quite important as well. It is very difficult to have a streamlined negotiation one where you feel you're able to properly, adequately protect your client's position if it's difficult for you to get instructions from that representative group because they may not be available readily. If you come across the circumstance where the representative group of that client is disparate, or they don't want to sit together, they don't agree with one another, and they've been authorised to act together, but they don't want to do so, you have to assess your ability to obtain instructions and proceed with negotiations, or in whichever legal regime you're working in, advise if you think it's appropriate of a need to call a meeting on the authorisation, so that you're able to address that issue, nip it in the bud, if you like, and proceed in a manner that enables you to get instructions, clear instructions from your client, advise them clearly, and move forward with the negotiations. I think it's important to reinforce that at an early stage that it's only possible for you to act on the instructions of the representative group, and certainly as for legal practitioners that's the case, and within the terms of their authorisation. So sometimes a group may be authorised to instruct you by a majority instructing you, and other times it may only be by unanimous decision of the group. It's important to remind the representative group, I think early on as well in the proceedings, that they may not agree on all things, but it's key to identify the matters that are fundamentally important to all of them there and to find common objectives. Usually, in my experience, and it is changing in Western Australia especially, but in my experience, a lot of the time the group you're working with, it might be the first time that they've actually sat together to hear advice and give instructions on certain matters like the protection of their native title rights and interests. And so that means that there needs to be a little bit of time for them to get used to their role and to understand what their job is as a representative of the broader group, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But certainly at the outset, I find it's quite key to identify matters that to seek to identify from that group what matters are fundamentally important to them, and more often than not, in my experience, the matters of fundamental importance are actually matters that are agreed on by that group. It's important to explain the ability to do the job as a negotiator to its best extent requires an effective information flow. That means going both ways. So from the community, from their broader family groups to you, and from you as the advisor back through to their family groups. That's very important. Sometimes these negotiations can go on for some time. A vacuum of information often leads to the creation of rumours and or sort of the people asserting certain things that aren't necessarily true. And the longer that the vacuum of information exists, the more those inaccurate positions or rumours can grow, and it can serve to derail the negotiations and put your client group in a very difficult and not particularly desirable position. So the information flow, effective information flow, is one that is very important. Another one that might seem obvious, but also it seems important to me to explain the benefits of being unified as against being divided in the face of the encroachment of the extractive industries or proposals for mining on the Indigenous communities' lands, so native title lands in this context. And it's also very important, I think, to allow time for that representative group to work together and to schedule community meetings with the broader groups. So again, that's to prevent that vacuum of information and to ensure that all people that are entitled to know what's going on are being advised appropriately and kept fully informed of the progress of negotiations. Strategies for Indigenous communities, so your client or the native title group in this context, for resource development on their native title lands. And certainly we like to give an initial presentation to the client group, the representative group, as to how to succeed in negotiations. There's certain strategies and approaches that we find are beneficial to groups in trying to push for an outcome that they want in the negotiation. So this is in sort of plain English and in these dot points and intended for the client group themselves. But also bear in mind that, the client group might not be speaking English as a first language, so or in whatever sort of context you're working in, you may need interpretive assistance. So in our context, sometimes the senior people on the representative groups speak several different Aboriginal languages before they speak English, and it's necessary to ensure that the the information is being conveyed effectively, so we need interpreters to assist with that. So in sort of plain English, the notes, the dot points that we would tend to run through are working out exactly what you want to, what the client group want, and to stay united in pushing for it, understanding the other side and what they want. So the other side being the proponent or the mining company, and we'll go into that a little bit more detail shortly. Having a clear plan about what to get, how to get what they want, so the strategy. Working hard to make sure that the agreement that they negotiate really works on the ground, so the implementation of it, of the agreement is really fundamentally important, and starting that work as early as is possible. Negotiations are often successful when traditional owners or native title groups get the things that they actually want. This is why the implementation aspect is so important. If the agreement is good on paper, but it doesn't work well in its implementation, people can't get what they want, and oftentimes that'll lead to the fractious outcomes and conflict post-agreement that we won't be touching on today, but certainly that can be a real issue if the agreement isn't working well in its implementation. It's also important to point out that different traditional owner groups may want different things. So where one negotiated agreement may look good from one party's perspective, another traditional owner group may have different priorities and different objectives. So a successful negotiation can lead to agreements that are quite different ultimately. More often than not, the fundamentals, which I will briefly run through a list of in the context of negotiations under the Future Acts regime in Western Australia, tend to feature the same fundamental clauses for protection of cultural heritage, environment, etc., native title, compensation for impacts, benefits, etc. But I'll come to those. It is also worthwhile pointing out that TOs, traditional owners, may not necessarily have a strong legal position. So the legal regime you're working with may not actually provide very strong rights to the traditional owners in their outset of their negotiations. Certainly the 6-month right to negotiate scheme isn't as strong as the native title groups that I work with would like their rights to be in responding to the threat of resource development on their native title lands. But where they're very clear about what they've wanted and stayed unified about what they want, when the going gets tough, when the company or the proponent's really pushing, and they've stayed clear on their strategy, then more often than not, that outcome is a successful one for the native title group. We also run through the plain English do's and don'ts of negotiations. This is quite crucial because for people that haven't been involved in the process before or haven't acted in the capacity of representative for their particular native title group, and they're not aware of the types of tactics that are used by within the extractive industries to promote their agenda, they can be not aware of the types of things that they should be in the negotiation process, and that can lead to a derailment of negotiations. So some key rules are never showing disunity to the other side. So this is the strategies for the client. So things to point out to the group who's representing the native title group. Never arguing with each other in front of the company. So that strength and unity is very important. Allowing space for argument and disagreement. If the group needs to, absolutely, robust discussion is important, but to do it in private without the other side being privy to it. The traditional owner group might fight amongst themselves. We say blue amongst themselves for those not familiar with the Australian lingo there, but very, very important never to show hints of disunity to the company. Making a plan for meetings and sticking to them. If things are going off track, it's very important to make people comfortable that they can change the plan or ask to take a break and talk about it. So taking a breakout session so that people feel comfortable that they've got sufficient time to discuss with their advisors or amongst themselves about what they want or what they're being told before they go back to the company. Never responding when the proponent or the company puts an offer on the table, whether they think it's a good one or a bad one, because oftentimes people don't understand what's being put, especially when it's put verbally. So it's important to remind the group to think hard about what they're being offered before a response is given. Not raising issues or putting opinions in a meeting that haven't been agreed beforehand. So again, touching on that authorisation issue earlier in the webinar, it's if the group is authorised to act as a group and not individually authorised, which is more often the case, then as in more often the case that they're authorised to act as a group, then putting opinions or raising issues that are pertinent to that individual but not to the group can be an issue. Certainly, it doesn't mean that people can't use their own voice to raise questions or concerns, but sometimes it's better to discuss them within the group before they're put to the company, and making sure any positions put have been carefully thought through. If people don't understand something or feel uncomfortable, which is very common given it's often it's a unique experience and one that's quite foreign, asking for a break to talk about it, to talk to advisors is really important. Not letting the group, so the representative group, be rushed by the company. That's a real issue. It's hasty decisions are often bad decisions. It's important that people have sufficient time to consider what they're being told so that they fully understand it. Being clear about the jobs that different people have and supporting people in those jobs is really important. If someone's been told to play a friendly role, then it's not wise to pull them into an argument. And it may be useful for people's jobs in the negotiation to change over time, but certainly to be aware of what different people's roles are is really important. Set clear goals for the negotiations, what you want out of the agreement, and that's really important at the outset, and I'll go through that shortly. Working with your representatives to set the strategy, making sure negotiations stay on track, and backing up representatives in dealing with the company or the proponent. Doing the hard talking with the company when it's required, so being strong on matters of serious concern to the native title group. Passing information, so I've addressed this already, from the community to the representatives and back. So that's an absolutely key role. And preparing for post-agreement signing, so getting the rules in place about how, for example, the compensation payments are dealt with, so via a trust fund. Getting ready for what the implementation of the agreement will look like is very important before the agreement is signed. For the representatives, so for the advisors, you're really providing technical advice, whether it be legal, economic, environmental, commercial. Do the hard negotiation when it's better for the native title representatives not to. You're assisting in getting the support for those traditional owners or the native title group from the government or from political groups if it's required. You're assisting in preparation for after the agreement is signed, so that I just touched on, so setting up trusts, for example, to manage the compensation payments that may be paid for the impact benefits under the agreement. Making sure the process of the negotiation is open and the agreement achieves free, prior and informed consent of the native title party, so in line with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Backing up the negotiation committee, so the committee or the representatives of the native title group and the community in dealing with the company. Providing advice on how to run the negotiations. obtaining funding for negotiations. So this one's can be quite a difficult one, and it depends in the context in which you're working. It's a very context-specific one as to when and if you can actually obtain funding for running the negotiation. It's becoming quite a common practice, I guess, in the Western Australian context, where the right to negotiate exists, that the native title party that has the right to negotiate representatives put to that proponent a negotiation protocol that provides for funding of the conduct of those negotiations. So funding to assist with the costs of the meetings of the native title group, the representatives that they wish to engage, and it also provides for mechanisms for dispute resolution between the native title group and the company. Perhaps some provisions around what types of terms should appear in the agreement that's being negotiated. But that is an important one, so that can keep the negotiations on track if it's economically viable. The process is economically viable. It's not costing the native title party lots of their own money and time to get themselves to meetings, to hear information and hear from their advisors and instruct their advisors on how to progress. Organise the negotiations, for example, the meetings of the company, finding and hiring good advisors, so not just legal but commercial, to explain the particular project that's being proposed, environmental advice on the particular environmental risks associated with the project. These are all important roles for the representative of the group. So what's important for the traditional owners, and how can a native title agreement help them achieve this? I say native title agreement, but again, outside of this jurisdiction, an agreement, a private contractual arrangement between the Indigenous community that's affected and the mining company or the proponent that's seeking to develop resource on their lands. What it will mean, and certainly in this context, is that whereas a proponent mining company might point to the current legal regimes in place in the particular jurisdiction and say that they're already obliged to comply with those statutes or laws, and that their obligations are already onerous enough, and that with a private contractual arrangement, the native title party or the Indigenous community that you're representing has an enforceable right to hold that proponent to terms which they feel are acceptable to them in providing their free, prior and informed consent to the particular project proceeding. The examples of the types of fundamental terms in these types of agreements that fall under the right to negotiate regime right to negotiate of the Future Act regime under the Native Title Act are rules for consent of the native title party, so that it must be on a free, prior and informed basis. Rules for money, so how the money, whether that be compensation payable for the impact on their native title rights and interests from the project, how that's dealt with under the agreement. Rules for work and training, so employment opportunities, business opportunities for the native title groups, training opportunities on the particular project. An important one, rules for cultural heritage, so what type of terms need to appear in that agreement for the particular group to be satisfied that they their cultural areas of concern are not going to be adversely impacted. Rules for environmental and land management, rules for business development, regional contributions, rules for disposal of assets by companies, rules for implementation of the agreement, so that very important one about how it operates. I've gone too too far. And rules for further agreements with traditional owners. So having terms that govern how they might deal with future agreements between that company and traditional owners. That might be to do with joint venture arrangements for business opportunities and the like. It's very important that your client group, so that the Indigenous communities that are faced with the proposal to develop resources on their lands, understand what the extractive industry is about, what drives mining companies. A lot of people won't have been faced with this before, and so it's very simple, but an idea might be to take them through a slide or explanation, pictorial or however can demonstrate it, what a mining company making profits looks like. So where it's income from the sale of minerals, for example, the number of tonnes multiplied by the price per tonne, minus their outgoings, that company's outgoings. So for example, wages, the actual mining operation itself, royalty payments, whether that be to the government or the native title parties, interest repayments on loans, the native title agreement itself. And if that is, the outgoings are smaller than the incoming, then that equals a profit for the mining company, which is the aim of the game. The mining company making a loss slide might look like something like this. Again, quite simple in pictorial terms, so showing that the incomings are smaller than the outgoings, and therefore that the mining company is making a loss. Explaining to your client group or the native title group that's going to be sort of impacted by the proposal, that the company's aim is to earn as much money as they can by selling as many tonnes or barrels or whatever it is they're extracting at the highest possible price, and spending as little as they can on wages, things required for the mine or the project, and on agreements, spending as little as they can on agreements with the native title holders. But it's important to note to the group that the companies also need to obey the law. For example, cultural heritage protection measures, whichever, if there happen to be legal regimes around that in your jurisdiction, or laws around protecting the environment, or in the Australian context, native title. And they also need to ensure the investors that have funded the building of their mine or the infrastructure feel that their investment is safe. For example, by having reached an agreement with the native title holders. So an assessment of the most viable jurisdictions for the extractive industries always includes a measure of the stability of the jurisdiction, and whilst that might often be a focus on what the government of the day is like, it from our perspective also must take into account whether there's a social license to operate, i.e. is there agreement and consent given on the part of the native title party or the Indigenous community that is affected by this particular project. So in trying to achieve those aims, companies might be compelled to reach agreement with traditional owners or native title groups to assist them in complying with the law and to keep their investors happy that the investment they've provided is safe. But they also are probably compelled to do that as cheaply as possible, given that incoming outgoings demonstration earlier. So to make as big a profit as possible. What that can mean for native title parties in negotiations is that sometimes there's a rush. So the company presses because they really need to meet certain timeframes to get the mine going or to get income in or for whatever reason. And that may lead to incomplete or insufficient information, which is not enabling the native title group or the Indigenous community to give free, prior and informed consent to the project as proposed. It can mean a lack of due process. So rushed decisions on behalf of the native title group or consents on the part of the native title holders that are given by the wrong people. If the process is rushed and the consultation isn't done properly, then certainly in the context of the area in which we work, so Western Australia, the affected native title holders are those that have to give the consent to the project, and identifying properly those that are the affected native title holders is a fundamental thing, and rushing the process can often lead to a process where the wrong people might have given consent for the project, or the wrong people have been consulted with. It can mean that for native title parties, there's a risk that a proponent or a mining company might circumvent the authorised representatives and go to members of the native title party who might be in favour of the development but aren't the authorised representatives of the broader group. That can lead to some very fractious outcomes of fighting within, and disparate outcomes for the group, so within family groups or between family groups of the affected Indigenous community. It can lead to the derailment of the negotiations, absolutely, which doesn't serve, certainly doesn't serve the interests of the native title party, because it sort of means that they're not in a position to protect their rights and interests and trying to achieve the objectives they're trying to achieve by way of the negotiation. It, in serious examples, can lead to damage to cultural heritage sites and places. So an example I can think of is where a rushed process and one where there wasn't adequate consultation or time given to the native title party meant that in one occasion that I can think of, the correct people for the area that was proposed to be explored weren't surveying it or monitoring it, and some ground disturbing works were done in a sacred place. And in another context where the company was rushing to meet the company's objectives, they went ahead and did works where the native title party wasn't present, where they would normally have ensured that there were monitors there for cultural monitoring on the ground for any ground disturbing works, and that company has also gone through and has then ultimately caused irreversible damage to a place of cultural significance to that particular native title party. And an obvious one is that it can cause conflict within and between family groups, both party and not party to the negotiations. So it can extend beyond the group that has the right to actually negotiate in respect of the proposed project. So taking the steps and the strategies that have been discussed earlier are very important in trying to ensure that these types of outcomes don't come to fruition. So I think I've sort of tried to keep to time. We're going to leave questions and comments in relation to the presentation to the end of Polly's presentation. So I'll hand over to Polly from here.
Thanks, Hayley. Diego, are you able to activate my screen? Diego, are you able to activate my screen, please?
So sorry, let me 1 second. Alejandra, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so I'm going to change the presentation. Hold on.
Thank you very much, Hayley. That was a great overview of all, with wonderful advice and specific recommendations for the advisors and the negotiators representing the Indigenous communities, and then the strategies and recommendations for the Indigenous communities or the traditional owners, as in the case of Australia. So thank you so much. As Hayley just said, we'll leave the questions and the comments at the end, and now we'll hand over to Polly Grace. Thank you so much, Polly. Please.
Great, thanks Alejandro, and thanks Hayley. So now turning to a different aspect of activities on Indigenous or community held land, I'm going to be talking about payment for environmental services and the risks and opportunities that this presents, looking specifically at a case example from Western Australia in relation to carbon offset projects. So just as an overview, what I will be talking about is looking briefly at what I mean when I speak about payment for environmental services, what the potential and threats and risks are to Indigenous people and local communities from these payment for environmental services, what opportunities these might present, and then looking at a specific case study of Indigenous savanna burning carbon projects, which we have operating in the Kimberley, and the lessons and tools that we've learned from these. So getting started, when we talk about payment for environmental services, what we're referring to is a payment for environmental or ecological outcome. So somebody is paying for people to manage their land and waters in such a way as to deliver that outcome. It is described as a market instrument, so using finances to deliver an environmental outcome. In terms of who pays, the people making a payment may be the government, the private sector, philanthropic or non-government organisations. So there's multiple users, but there's also multiple beneficiaries. And generally speaking, environmental services or payment for environmental services sort of claim that they are delivering a public good. And so it's the general population who benefits. But as well as that, the person being paid, the landholder, is going to be receiving a financial benefit. And there might be some indirect benefits as well that they're getting from the land management. I've put some examples up there. A hydropower company might pay a landowner to conserve vegetation in a watershed. This is something that I understand is occurring in Costa Rica, where there's a water tariff with some of that money going into payment for environmental services and back to the people who are managing the land in the watershed. A community group could raise money to pay farmers to amend their farming practices in order to protect a threatened species. So, for example, in the USA, a community group raised sufficient money to pay farmers to not harvest hay as frequently in order to protect a bird habitat at a critical time of year. And then the last example I put up there is related to the climate change market. A government pays a local community to manage their forests and maintain trees as a carbon sink. And this is what a lot of people might have heard referred to as REDD or REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and land degradation. So that, in a very brief nutshell, is what payment for environmental services is. And it gives
so a number of potential challenges and risks. So in terms of those challenges and risks, I've summarized them into a couple of areas. One of the first is governance. So sorry, just having some technical difficulties. So in terms of governance, the it's important that the initiative is being led by the Indigenous community or being motivated by the local community, so that it's owned and operated by them. And if that's not the case and you have a third party coming in and saying, look, we want to do this on your land, then you have a real potential for conflict. Making sure, checking what the role of the Indigenous community or the local community is in the design and outcomes of the payment for environmental services, and making sure it has free, prior and informed consent. Oftentimes this isn't the case, and there are a lot of examples of conflict arising out of payment for environmental services that are particularly around the RED Plus example, where the projects weren't being driven by Indigenous people, or the Indigenous governance structures weren't in place. A second challenge is around land ownership and tenure. And this is particularly important in the area of payment. For getting this right is particularly important in the area of payment for environmental services, because a policy or initiative which creates incentives for third parties to come on to traditional lands and use and benefit from activities on those traditional lands needs to make sure that it provides specific protections for Indigenous rights. So making sure that Indigenous and community land rights are being protected, and that the mechanism doesn't operate as a way that undermines Indigenous rights. So, for example, if there isn't formal tenure in place recognising Indigenous land rights, it's possible that a payment for environmental services mechanism could be a way for other people to come in and assert external land rights. Also making sure it recognises and upholds the rights of Indigenous people to assert a say in any decision making, and then whether or not it affects the underlying land rights. So it's possible that payment for environmental services should be able to operate on top of or alongside existing land rights without actually affecting or undermining them. So that's an important aspect. Another challenge is in relation to the opportunity cost versus benefit sharing. So it's important that the payment that's coming from these environmental services adequately recognises the lost opportunity that the Indigenous or local community is agreeing to. So Hayley highlighted some of the opportunities, for example, that are presented by the extractive industries. So if a community decides to forego those opportunities because it's going to manage its land for conservation outcomes or as a biodiversity offset, then they must be adequately compensated for that opportunity cost. And there's a tendency, I think, for people to, or a willingness for people to lock up Indigenous lands and lock people out of economic development because there's this attitude of, well, that's in keeping with their cultural rights, or that's in keeping with what they want to do. And I think that really it's important that is questioned, and that people are adequately compensated for the things that they are foregoing. So there's some of the challenges that could arise from payment for environmental services. Turning to some of the opportunities that are provided. There's an opportunity, and it depends obviously on the individual community, and it's going to be different in each scenario, but there's an opportunity for alignment with aspirations for management of country. So where Indigenous people or the local community desire to manage their country for cultural and environmental purposes, there's an opportunity here for them to receive financial benefit from doing that, and so for that to become an economically viable option for managing their country without needing to go down the route of, for example, extractive industries or what other opportunities might exist. In Australia in particular, it has the potential to reduce reliance on grants, but particularly government grants, and so to break that model of welfare dependence which can sometimes exist in remote communities. There's also an opportunity to strengthen and provide greater recognition for Indigenous land rights as a result of accessing the payment for environmental services opportunity. So, and that's in particular the area that I want to explore more through providing a bit of a look at an Australian case study. So turning now to the case study, I'm going to just look at some of what we call carbon projects that exist in the Kimberley region of Australia. So this is in the northwest of Australia. And these projects operate to generate carbon credits from traditional fire management activities undertaken by Indigenous groups who hold native title rights. So, as outlined on the screen, late dry season fires in Australia cause significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. In the north of Australia, the fire regime is such that the country burns on average every year, and there's a big difference between the types of fire, whether it burns early or late. So if the country burns late in the year, then the fires will burn very hot, and there is a significant, and will be big, will cover a larger land area, and more trees, more wood is consumed by that fire. And if a fire burns early in the year, when it's cooler, then that fire will burn cooler. We use the word cooler, not as hot, and it will burn a smaller area, and it will consume less fuel. So it won't burn big trees or anything. It'll be a small fire in the undergrowth, and it'll just trickle through. So extensive scientific research demonstrates that by burning early in the year, it's possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make a significant difference to Australia's overall emissions profile. So the Australian government worked with traditional owners to better understand how they have traditionally managed country, and developed up what they call a method or a set of rules to issue or generate carbon credits from activities that reduce late dry season fires through using traditional Indigenous land management techniques. So this graph kind of pictorializes how those carbon credits are generated. In the first column, you see the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted historically. The second column shows what happens with the change in management practices, and the third column shows the difference, which is the amount of carbon credits that can be issued. The key thing about this method is that it's based on the way that Indigenous people in North Australia used to manage their country. So pre-colonisation, before people were removed from country, there was a lot of people living on the land and managing fire through early dry season burning. That management regime shifted, and as a result, there was high greenhouse gas emissions. And with this new carbon method, we're seeking to go back to the traditional method of fire management. So this Indigenous Savannah carbon method has been highly successful. There's 32 registered Indigenous carbon projects across Northern Australia, and they're generating significant income for Indigenous land management. Over 100 million generated over the last 10 years. A lot of this revenue, that's important to note, is being reinvested back into the fire management and into Indigenous land management. So it's not all profit, that's revenue. And so one of the challenges the projects continue to face is meeting their operating costs. But the important thing is that as we looked at, is as an opportunity to bring revenue streams into Indigenous land management. So the benefits of this payment for environmental services opportunity of Indigenous carbon projects are really extensive, and they're starting to be quite extensively documented. So it's not just the economic benefits of Indigenous people earning income and the climate benefits of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but also an increase in biodiversity because of the reducing destructive late season fires and doing good early dry season cool fires. Passing on traditional knowledge, so you have elders going out on country with young rangers and teaching them how they used to burn. Protecting cultural sites, so the burning will be done around rock art sites and other important cultural sites. And employment, training and development in remote and marginalised communities. So it's delivering really extensive benefits. In terms of, so generally speaking, with these carbon projects, we talk about them as being a win-win-win situation. You know, the Indigenous communities are benefiting. It's something that they would like to be doing. It helps take care of country. The environment and the greenhouse is benefiting because you've got a reduction in carbon credits, and companies and government are benefiting because they're able to buy carbon credits. But in terms of how we got there and why is this particular payment for environmental services so successful, there was 3 in particular essential elements that I've drawn out. So the first one was that the technology is based in traditional knowledge. So it's something that was driven by and for Indigenous people. So yes, other non-Indigenous people are definitely benefiting from this technology, but it was founded in a traditional practice and has that cultural grounding, which is really important. In the early days, there was actually an attempt to patent the method by a non-Indigenous person, and that was resisted successfully, so that Indigenous people are able to access this method, and that traditional knowledge hasn't been misappropriated. The other thing that's been really key has been the recognition of Indigenous rights. So due to the unique nature of Indigenous land rights in Australia, and Hayley's talked about the Native Title Act a little bit, and the other land rights scheme we have is Aboriginal Land Rights Land. A potential challenge that existed for Indigenous people was proving that they had a right to do a carbon project. And so in designing the legislation, the government recognised that this could be a barrier for Indigenous people. And so they designed the legislation in such a way as to enable Indigenous people to participate by deeming them to have the right to participate where they had native title land. And a third element that's been really successful to the ability of Indigenous people to access this opportunity has been startup packages. So getting a project, an Indigenous carbon project, up and off the ground can be quite expensive, because you've got to be able to access the opportunity, understand the law, and put in place the framework to report on the carbon project. And for a lot of Indigenous groups, this wouldn't be possible without some upfront capital and funds. And so in the original design of the scheme, money was put aside to specifically facilitate Indigenous involvement. So turning now to skills and tools, what are the learnings? How did we actually get here? How did we get these good outcomes? One of the biggest things is that this has happened over a long period of time. It hasn't been short term. So over 10 years ago, so 13 years ago, the first Indigenous pilot carbon project was established. And that was established out of a partnership of private sector, so an industrial development project, and an Indigenous group. So instead of waiting around for the government to set up a carbon offset scheme, these two organisations partnered together and started actually demonstrating through a real life example what could happen. So that was a really important kickstart. And then following on from that and the success of that, building on it, there was a lot of strategic lobbying and involvement with government. So since the Australian government first started talking about carbon markets over 10 years ago, the Kimberley Land Council and other Indigenous representative bodies have been engaging with the government and really mounting an argument about the need to make sure that Indigenous rights are properly protected and enabled in this legislation. So at this time, there was a real vision that was held by Indigenous people for a thriving Indigenous carbon industry. And this was an easy sell to make to government. Hey, look, if you support this opportunity, if you put in place the right laws, then we can build a thriving Indigenous carbon industry, win-win-win. You know, Indigenous people get these rights. You guys are going to get your offsets. The environment's protected. So it was an easy sell, but it also required ongoing and long-term engagement. And there was, you know, a lot of meetings, a lot of letters and submissions. And as part of that, to help coordinate that, there was a lot of information gathering and exchange. So the Indigenous groups across Northern Australia are working really closely together and sharing information Indigenous rangers traveling from one part of the country to another and saying, hey, what are you guys doing? Maybe we can replicate that over here. And having those information exchanges was really key for awareness raising and to raise the momentum and the voices who were then passing that information on to government and saying, look, this is important. And so now, 10 years on, what started off as informal engagement is now starting to crystallise, where we've got an Indigenous carbon industry network, which is an informal group, but where Indigenous people have come together and said, okay, well, this is the voice through which we engage with government. But Indigenous people are also engaging not just with each other and with government, but also with the corporate sector. So linking into what the corporate sector's priorities are and making sure that they have a voice there and that they can influence outcomes in that area as well. And then the other thing that's been really essential is demonstrating the outcomes. So selling the story and talking about how successful these projects are, talking about the really beneficial outcomes so that it becomes quite clear that the support needs to continue and it needs to grow, and it becomes challenging or difficult for any company or for the government to withdraw its support, so that those positive policy parameters need to stay in place. So just to recap, you know, in terms of the tools and lessons that we've learned from the Indigenous carbon projects in the Kimberley, and how that could apply to other opportunities for payment for environmental services, making sure that the community is informed. So what is the opportunity and what are the potential benefits and risks when that opportunity presents itself, whether it's REDD+ or protection of a watershed or a carbon offset project, understanding what that is. And then based on that information, developing a vision of what is the outcome. And Hayley talked about this in terms of extractive industries, and I think it applies equal here. What's the being very clear of what the outcome is that the community or Indigenous group wants to achieve and what the pathway is that they want to get there. Making sure you engage early with government, you know, at the time when the policy is first being developed, at the time when the law is first being developed. So identifying how you can engage with government, and if you don't have the inroads, who can assist you, who can work with you, if there's other non-governmental organisations that you might be able to work with to get those ins, and making sure you're engaging early to sell that vision and get the government on board with that. Or other groups who are developing the scheme or the legislation or the payment for environmental services opportunity. And then doing outreach and networking, so your voice is not on your own. Thinking broadly who else can benefit from this opportunity and how we can work with them, and establishing a network that's not just the Indigenous community, but where you can loop in corporates, the philanthropic sector, the environmental sector. And then if you're able to demonstrate the outcomes, whether or not it's from your particular project that's up and running, or whether you can point to another project in another jurisdiction and say, look, this is why this is really important, this is why you should care about it and why you should support doing it properly. So that's some of the key policy principles that we've come up with that to underpin payment for environmental service opportunities. Some of the questions that we recommend to policymakers when they say, you know, okay, how do we evaluate whether or not this is a good opportunity or not? These are some of the examples of the principles that we've come up with. So does it enable Indigenous participation so that Indigenous people are able to participate equally to other stakeholders and are able to overcome legal, policy, financial or other barriers? Is it aligned with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, in particular the right to free, prior and informed consent? So making sure that people have a right to say yes or no, and have input on how that project's actually implemented, because something like a payment for environmental services, which, as I said at the beginning, is something which incentivizes people coming onto traditional lands and using traditional resources for an environmental outcome, should only occur where it's got the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous communities. And then making sure that it protects and promotes Indigenous and community-led rights. And the example that I've just gone through from the Kimberley, because the government put in place legislation that specifically deemed and enabled native title holders to participate, it's been positive not just from the perspective of native title holders being able to undertake this activity and make money from that activity, but also to illustrate the opportunities that can arise from land rights, from Indigenous land rights, that Indigenous people aren't locked into a traditional, into a lifestyle where they, can't make money from their land. They can leverage opportunities and they can leverage economic opportunities, and these can be sustainable. So it can actually be an opportunity to not just uphold Indigenous and community land rights, but actually to promote them and further those rights. So that's it from my end. I'll hand back to you, Alejandra, to coordinate any questions that people might have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Holly, for your presentation, for sharing the challenge, highlighting the challenges around pests and also the benefits, and then the example that you've used, or that you've shown to us, that you've shared with us on the Savannah Carbon projects. It's really a wealth of information here, and so much I think so many other communities can learn from. I would like now, we have about 20 minutes, and I'd like to open the floor to our participants. I remind the participants that you can send a question, a written question, or you can click on the icon with the hand if you'd like to ask a question live. So I'd like to once again thank Hayley, Haas, and Polly Grace for their presentations, and I open the floor to our participants. It was really what was great about these presentations was how practical they are. These very helpful tips and steps that communities can take in terms of when dealing with a negotiation, or when confronted in a potential situation of conflict, and how to go about it, and then seeing it also from the perspective of the legal side, how both sides will work towards trying to reach a favorable agreement. So, are there any questions? I am just checking if we have any questions from our participants. We have quite a large group of participants, but I'm not seeing any questions yet. I guess perhaps I could ask a question, Holly, with regard to the pests. I was wondering, this great example that you have from Northwestern Australia, and I know you mentioned that you've been able to, how have you been able to perhaps share this example in other parts of Australia? And has there been interest in other parts of the world? I imagine that the issue of fire management and savanna burning is one that is very applicable to other regions also in the world. Have there been these opportunities to share these experience, this great example? Perhaps I'm thinking in Brazil, or in other parts of Asia or Africa as well. How can this mechanism be applied, and how can the experience of pests perhaps be promoted somewhere else?
Thanks, Alejandra. Yeah, the map, which I think you guys can see on screen, shows the distribution of these projects across Northern Australia. So the top left-hand side of the screen shows the Kimberley region where I'm based, but actually you'll see that these projects are spread quite broadly across most of Northern Australia. So there has been really great uptake by Indigenous groups across Australia. In terms of taking that outside of Australia and overseas, there is research being done by the Australian government and United Nations University on specifically whether or not these Indigenous savanna burning projects can be done in other countries. And Indonesia, Brazil, and Mexico, and a number of countries in Africa have been identified as potential opportunities. So the criteria being that you have to have the certain vegetation type being savanna grassland, and a traditional or historical practice, which to manage fire and shift the burning regime from a bad wildfire regime to a good controlled fire regime. So there are a number of opportunities, and we're looking at, and the Australian government is looking into how that can be shared internationally. But I think already through market mechanisms in the climate change context and outside of that, you know, there are a lot of payment for environmental services opportunities internationally with REDD+, with the emerging blue carbon opportunities in places like Papua New Guinea, and then with payment for environmental services in places like Costa Rica. So it's just making sure, I guess, that those opportunities are leveraged in such a way that protects and promotes Indigenous rights with the appropriate governance structures, rather than realizing those risks, which is the potential undermining of Indigenous rights or local community rights if they're being driven by an external party rather than by the community itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Polly, for that explanation and examples of how these could be applied in other contexts. I do see a question here. Allow me to read it. And we have actually now 2 questions, so from our participants. One is from Jennifer Baldwin. I will read the question to you. Have the speakers found Indigenous carbon credits or other PES to garner a premium on the market compared with other projects? Given the limited global demand for these services, that could be great news. That's question 1. And the second question is from Sarah Deitch, who is from UNDP. And this question is, in both contexts, mining and savanna carbon projects, when trying to obtain free, prior, and informed consent from the affected Indigenous title holders, have you seen any particularly good approaches or protocols where the IP representatives in the negotiation communicate and obtain consent from their communities on key issues? What are the best examples you've seen on this? So I will let perhaps Polly on the PES, which is the Payment for Environment Services, and then obviously the free, prior, and informed consent question can be used in both with both presenters. I hand over the floor to you, Polly and Hayley. Thank you.
Thanks, Alejandra. I mean, on the first question, my understanding is that it was going to the market for payment for environmental services. The question was whether or not there was demand. I'm not sure if I understood that correctly. So at the moment, I mean, in Australia, there is what they call the Emission Reduction Fund, which is a form of market mechanism whereby the government purchases carbon credits or carbon offsets from project proponents. So there is a local market with demand. Certainly post-Paris Agreement, you know, there's varying views on whether or not the market for carbon credits is going to grow or shrink. And I wouldn't want to speculate too widely, but, you know, in the context where climate change is a real threat and an increasing number of countries are committing to taking action on this issue, I think inevitably market mechanisms are going to be part of that. And so you will see a demand for these types of projects grow. Outside of the specific carbon examples, for payment for environmental services more broadly, certainly in the Kimberley and in the Australian context, we are finding an increasing number of people talking about these type of services, particularly as, again, you know, with development, you see more and more threats to ecosystems, and so a desire to recognise and give financial value to the protection of existing ecosystems, and so payment for environmental services being a mechanism for that. So I think on that one, you know, the demand does appear, that the appetite does appear to be there, and it's just, you know, post-Paris and with the current position, there is uncertainty, but certainly within different domestic spheres, there is some regulatory backing. Hayley, I don't know if you want to kick off with the second question.
Sure, Polly. So in terms of examples, or whether we've seen examples of engagement with native title groups where the free, prior and informed consent of those groups has been obtained in relation to a proposed resource development on their native title lands. Look, probably in my experience, taking examples from various proponents and various negotiations, rather than one, say, in particular as a standout. Generally speaking, where there have been negotiation protocols or resourcing protocols agreed at the outset and very early on in the proceedings, where the native title parties' rights kick in to govern how those negotiations will proceed and to resource the native title party in that process, that usually leads to sort of some good examples of how the negotiations can proceed to ensuring that free, prior and informed consent at the point of coming to an agreement on the project. Examples for where that negotiation protocol or resourcing protocol provides for the native title party to obtain independent advisors, not just legal but commercial advisors and environmental advisors, and where that proponent provides over to the native title party their own reports, for example, or their own commercially sensitive information about the project, obviously subject to terms of confidentiality agreements, so that the native title party can obtain their own independent advice on that information and make an assessment of whether what they're being told by the proponent is in fact accurate. In an environmental context, I've seen a very good example in the context of a company proposing to undertake hydraulic fracturing on native title lands that went across 3 different native title group areas, and that particular proponent agreed to fund the native title groups establishing an independent panel of experts, both academic and industry sourced experts, in the various environmental risk areas of hydraulic fracturing, to review the company's own advice that they had received on the risks associated and the risk assessment of their project, and report back on to those native title groups on the independent panel's view of how robust and accurate those assessments were, and ultimately those native title groups were in the position to, or well, 2 in particular were in the position that they were faced with this proposal and obtained a veto over the proposed use of hydraulic fracture stimulation on their native title lands in respect of that particular project. So that's probably at the sort of better end of the spectrum in terms of achieving the free, prior and informed consent of native title parties in certainly in response to the mining industry.
Thank you. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for that response and for that example, and also thank you very much, Polly, as well, for your response to the question on the payment for environment services. Given that we are now reaching the end of our webinar, and I do not see any other questions, neither none that are written or anyone who would like to ask one live. So I would like to close now and thank very much our presenters, Polly Grace from the Kimberley Land Council and Hayley Haas from Arma Legal, both in Australia. I wanted to let also the participants know that we will be posting the webinar recording on our NBSAP Forum YouTube channel. So the webinar, anyone would be able to listen again or send any other information or questions and post them through the NBSAP Forum homepage. So we look forward to our continued discussion virtually through the forum, through the NBSAP Forum. Thank you again very much to our presenters and to all the participants that were with us during our session today. We hope you have all enjoyed this session. I have certainly learned a lot, and I look forward to staying in touch with these very capable resource women here. And we look forward to more of your active participation during the next during our next webinar sessions, which will be taking place next week. We will have next Tuesday, we will have another session on communication and intercultural communication, and that session will be held in Spanish. So thank you very much, Hayley, and thank you very much, Polly. I don't know if you have some last remarks that you'd like to share. I invite you. And again, I would like to thank my colleague, Diego Ochoa, again as well. Hayley and Polly, any last wise words that you'd like to share with us?
No, just thank you again, Alejandra, for organising in Diego, and to the participants for joining us today. We wish you the best of luck in your endeavours and efforts, and hopefully we can learn from other people's experiences as well here in Australia.
I second what Polly says. Thanks very much, Alejandra and Diego, and thanks for the participants. And hopefully there was something in the examples that we were able to provide today that you can apply in your own various contexts of work.
Great, exactly. We will be sharing also, if you don't mind, your contact information in case anyone would like to get in touch with you, Hayley or Polly, if that's okay. And I'm now receiving some thank yous from the participants for the presentations. Many thanks to all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.